Hi everybody, it's Andy and welcome again to my office in Modesto, California. I'm an attorney licensed to practice law in California as well as New York. In this video we're going to continue our tour of California statutes by going over something called a shopkeeper's privilege. Now, those of you who are lawyers, those of you who went to law school, hopefully you remember back to your first year torts class where you learned about shopkeeper's privilege most likely. Now when I took torts during my first year of law school, I learned shopkeeper's privilege as a defense specifically to a charge of false imprisonment. I've met a lot of lawyers who learned it that same way, but I've also met a lot of lawyers who learned shopkeeper's privilege as a standalone defense. So I mean, regardless of how you learn it, the idea is the same. So I've also met some lawyers, I guess, who went to law school years ago. They have no idea what I'm talking about. I've also met a lot of non-lawyers who have no idea what I'm talking about either when I talk about shopkeeper's privilege. So the idea behind a shopkeeper's privilege is basically something like this. So let's say that you run a business, and as a result of doing so, you sell things. Like, you run a store, you sell groceries, you sell, widgets, wallets, cameras, whatever. So in the course of doing that, let's say that you reasonably suspect that one of your customers is stealing from you, committing, theft, shoplifting, whatever it is. So the shopkeeper's privilege basically says that you, as the owner of the business, you can do it yourself, you can authorize your employees to do it, regardless of who does it, as long as you authorize it, you can go ahead and use reasonable means to detain this person to investigate and see whether or not your shoplifting suspicions are actually correct. So those of you who are business owners and are selling things at your business, before you guys rush out and start detaining people left and right, there's two very important criteria. So number one is that the suspicion you have has to be a reasonable one. Now my rule of thumb for reasonableness basically is that it has to be something objective that you can point to it and describe it to somebody else who is a healthy skeptic, and they're not going to think you're crazy. They're not going to think you're just making it up. They're not going to think that it's all in your head. So anyway, number one is the suspicion that you have that this person is shoplifting. It has to be a reasonable one. And number two is that once you have this reasonable suspicion, you are entitled to use reasonable means to detain this person, but you cannot use all means. So that said, I guess a lot of you are probably wondering, well, Andy, what does reasonableness mean? Like, what does reasonable mean? Like, can I do this? Can I not do this? Like, I don't know, how do I actually use reasonable? That doesn't help me. So unfortunately, the word reasonable is very vague. And unfortunately as well, a lot of stuff in law is written that way. Reasonableness depends on the situation. There's no kind of magical formula. There's no hard and fast rule. Reasonable, what reasonable is, varies from situation to situation. So that unfortunately is not very useful in terms of like an application kind of thing. But those of you who are interested and you want to look this up, California is actually very nice. It actually codifies the shopkeeper's privilege in a statute. So the statute in question is California Penal Code section 490.5F. And as always, I will go ahead and paste and link it down below in the description for you. But 490, Penal Code section 490 generally deals with theft of various kinds, petty theft, grand theft, all kinds of stuff like that. 490.5F, however, is where they talk about the business owner, or I think they call it the merchant's right to detain people who they suspect of committing theft from their business. So 490.5F, there's a whole bunch of subsections to it. 490.5F, for whatever reason, also allows theater owners to reasonably detain people who they reasonably suspect of operating recording equipment without the theater owner's permission. I'm assuming that's because Hollywood, is in California. The movie industry is very big. There's a lot of influence there. But for whatever reason, shopkeeper's privilege in California also includes theater owners and people who they suspect, reasonably suspect, of course, of operating recording equipment without authorization. So 490.5F is where it's all at. If you're interested about learning about shopkeeper's privilege, yeah. So. Hopefully that made sense. Shopkeeper's privilege is not a real big deal. I personally don't know any kind of business owners who kind of run into it and stuff, but hopefully it's something that, because of that, it's not something that's also well known either. So the average person that I run into probably kind of, wonders about it when they go to places like Costco, let's say, where they have, inspections and stuff, like, you have to show your receipt in order to get out the door. Costco is a slightly different situation. Shopkeeper's privilege does not apply there. Yeah, but I mean, like, that's probably the most common situation that is shopkeeper privilege that the average person encounters. So hopefully all of that made sense. Go ahead and subscribe, leave me a comment, do all that nice stuff, and I will talk to you guys next time. Thanks.